Hello, you're watching Broadcasting Scotland. It's Wednesday the 3rd of August and I'm Hugh Stewart with Scotland at 7. Now tonight we have a special programme and a special guest. I'm going to introduce first of all Roger Mullin, who has launched, along with two other economic specialists, launched a new group which is going to examine the economic case for Scottish independence. You could say it's a bit of a positive case for why it's better to be independent, right? Roger, so we're going to discuss that in detail in a few minutes. So thanks for joining us tonight. Can you hear and see us okay?
Yes, I can indeed. Good to be here.
That's excellent. So this is a special really on the launch of a new group called The Bottom Line, looking at Scottish economics under dependency in the UK and under moving to independence. So we're going to look at that in a few minutes, but first of all, I'm going to look at the update from Ukraine on day 161 since Russia invaded its neighbour. And the first shipment of grain to leave Ukraine under a deal to ease Russia's naval blockade has reached Turkey. The Sierra Leone registered ship, the Razone, set sail from Odessa port for Lebanon on Monday under an accord brokered by Turkey and the United Nations. The ship has been inspected by members of the Joint Coordination Centre and is now expected to move through the Bosphorus Strait shortly. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has insisted that Russia has no reasons to hold up the return of a gas turbine for the Nord Stream 1 gas pipeline. The turbine is stranded in Germany following servicing in Canada in an escalating standoff which has resulted in flows to Europe falling to a trickle just at 20% of capacity. The UN has said that there have been over 10 million border crossings in and out of Ukraine since Russia launched its illegal invasion of the country on the 24th of February. Data gathered by the UNHCR indicates that 6,180,345 individual refugees from Ukraine are now recorded across Europe. The UK's Ministry of Defence says there's likely to be an increase in civilians attempting to flee Kherson and the surrounding area as hostilities continue and food shortages worsen, putting pressure on transport routes. They've also said that a Ukrainian strike against a Russian ammunitions train in Kherson Oblast, southern Ukraine, means it's highly unlikely that the rail link between Kherson and Crimea is operational. Mykola Tokitsky, the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, has repeated Ukraine's request for the skies over nuclear installations to be closed to prevent a potential accident or their misuse. Ukrainian refugees are likely to become victims of rising tensions and disinformation campaigns in their host countries, a new report has warned. False reports exaggerating how much aid refugees receive compared with local people, as well as linking refugees with violent crime and political extremism, could cause a breakdown in relations with local communities, the charity World Vision has said. A group of Russian soldiers have accused their commanders of jailing them in eastern Ukraine for refusing to take part in the war. Russia has accused the US of being directly involved in the war by supplying targeting information for Ukraine's long-range missile strikes. The G7 is threatening to further deprive Russia of revenue by blocking services that enable the transportation of its oil globally if it doesn't heed the proposed oil price cap. Russia has carried out deadly strikes against Ukrainians in eastern Kharkiv and Mykolaiv regions, according to Reuters, who said that they have yet to verify the battle reports. Now I'm going to quickly run through today's headlines before we look at Roger Mullin and talk about the launch of the Bottom Line campaigns. First of all, inflation. The UK's annual inflation could go as high as 15% by the start of 2023, experts have forecast, as further sharp increases in energy prices push up the cost of living. On the eve of the latest decision on interest rates by the Bank of England, the Resolution Foundation think tank says price pressures were likely to be stronger and to last longer than the bank had previously forecast. The UK's worsening cost of living crisis will cost millions of households their savings unless the UK government increases support for households immediately, the National Institute for Economic and Social Research has warned today. The NIESR said that the UK was sliding into a recession that will hammer the most deprived areas of the country and force more than 1 million households to choose between heating their homes and purchasing sufficient food. The recession could impact the savings of 2.5 million households, with 1 in 5 UK households having no savings at all by 2024. The poorest 10% will be worse off by a further 5%. The Tory election race, the delivery of ballot papers to around 160,000 Conservative members to vote for the next UK Prime Minister has been delayed following security concerns. The postal ballot packs were due to be sent out on Monday a couple of days ago. However, members have been informed the ballot papers could arrive as late as the 11th of August. The decision to delay the sending out of the ballots follows advice from the National Cyber Security Centre, part of the UK's GCHQ listening post. From England and Wales, we hear that drug-related deaths have reached a record level across England and Wales as a growing number of people die after using opiates and cocaine, according to official figures. In 2021, 4,859 people were recorded as having died from drug poisoning. That's the equivalent of 84.4 deaths per million, according to the Office for National Statistics, the ONS. This is 6.2% higher than the rate for 2020, and that's the 9th consecutive annual rise and the highest number since records began in 1993. The French Parliament has approved a bill that will lift pensions and allow companies to make higher tax-free bonus payments to employees after President Emmanuel Macron promised to boost household purchasing power amid soaring inflation. President Macron has been keen to strike a cross-party compromise on the bill after losing his absolute majority in the June legislative elections. The legislation increases pensions and some welfare payments by 4% and sets a cap on rent increases at 3.5%. Civil servants will receive a 3.5% pay rise. A state finance rebate of 18 cents per litre on fuel will be increased to 30 cents per litre in September and October. Meanwhile, companies will be able to offer employees annual tax-free bonuses of €6,000, which is up from €1,000 previously. In America, we hear today that President Biden is set to sign a second executive order on Wednesday, that's later on today, that aims to protect access to reproductive health care after the US Supreme Court struck down the constitutional right to abortion. The order directs the Health and Human Services Department to consider ways to expand coverage for patients travelling out of state for reproductive health care. This announcement follows a victory for abortion rights supporters in Kansas on Tuesday night, when citizens voted in a referendum to continue to protect abortion in that state's constitution. The result is being seen as a huge loss for the anti-abortion movement and a major win for abortion rights advocates across America. And finally, our story of a 90-foot sculpture of the bacterium E. coli. A 90-foot-long inflatable sculpture by Bristol-based Luke Jerram has been suspended from the ceiling of the National Museum of Scotland's Grand Gallery. The E. coli, which is 5 million times bigger than the real bacterium, is on display in Scotland for the first time. Luke Jerram's E. coli is part of the 18th edition of the Edinburgh Arts Festival, which is running now from the 28th of July to the 28th of August. In venues across Edinburgh, as are the exhibitions Anatomy, A Matter of Life and Death, and Japanese Contemporary Design, both of which are also on at the National Museum of Scotland during the festival. So that's the Edinburgh Festival happening right now. So that's a quick run through tonight's news headlines, and I'm going to turn to our major story tonight, which is the release by my guest Roger Mullin and his two colleagues of a new report and a new initiative looking at the positive economic benefits of independence. So I think, Roger Mullin, I think we could say, looking at your report, you're arguing that independence is good for your mental health as well as for your economic health. Would that be a good way of summarising the first report?
Yes, it is going to have remarkable benefits in a whole series of fronts, not merely the economic ones. There are social benefits to be had, psychological benefits to be had. And so from that point of view, it looks at Scotland, it looks at the economy in a somewhat different way from the narrow focus that has often dominated debates in the past.
Okay, so we'll look in detail at the first paper. Let me just outline who are your colleagues, really. First of all, If you haven't met Roger Mullin before, who's been a frequent contributor to Scotland at 7, Roger was a Member of Parliament for Fife up until 2015, I think it was. And you also have various posts at the University of Stirling. And you have also held various posts for United Nations. You're also active currently in a charity which helps people who have received explosion injuries, such as people who have came across landmines, that kind of thing. So you're active across those areas. So there are three of you who have produced the first report for the Bottom Line Scotland. So who are your other two collaborators, Roger?
Well, first of all, Prof. David Simpson, who is a long-standing friend and a very long-standing supporter of Scottish independence. David has had a very distinguished career, both as an academic. He was at one time, for example, when he was doing his PhD at Harvard, he worked alongside Vasily Leontiev, who went on to win the Nobel Prize in Economics. He was the founding director, along with the late Jim McGilvray, of the Fraser of Allender Institute. And then at a later stage in his life, he left academia as a professor to become the chief economist of Standard Life. And he's written widely on economics. And I think it would be safe to say David could be described as a classical economist. The other person is Graham Blackett, who has had a long-standing career of running a commercial economy consultancy that has operated both here and internationally, providing services to governments, to universities and the like in different parts of the world, but particularly in Europe. And then there's myself. So the person who really sparked this at the beginning was David Simpson, in a conversation with me. And many years ago, it must be 50 years ago or thereabouts, he wrote a little booklet at that time on the economics of Scottish independence. And reflecting on that, what David said is, for about the last 50 years, the debate has been narrowly focused on what are the costs of independence. And in that sense, we have always fought on other people's ground. And he said to me something which was, in one sense, very simple, but also, I thought, remarkably powerful. And he says, nobody has ever done an analysis of the price of dependence on the UK. And that, in part, is what some of our subsequent papers are going to be about, putting figures and putting analysis onto what the price is of being dependent upon a failing UK economy and the failing UK state, which is very much exemplified, Hugh, by some of the stories that you read out.
Yes, indeed. The UK is suffering from extremely serious inflation and heading towards slowdown, if not recession. And it seems that UK inflation is, in fact, higher than many of the other countries in Europe. But the bottom line, the three of you who have extensive experience as academics and as people who have been involved in practical running economies or advising economies, but the three of you have put together the start of an economic package arguing that, in fact, independent countries can actually make their own decisions and make better decisions, right? So the first of the papers, we're going to look through the first, shortly, the first of the various briefing papers you will be producing. But just before we do that, let's explain who the bottom line is. Those are the people, but what do you want to do with it and where do people find it? Let me just look it up again. So your website was launched today, wasn't it? So it's just actually gone live and it's on thebottomline.scot. So that's where people can find you. And if you look at that website, it contains a briefing paper on the positive case for Scottish independence, which I have printed off here, and we will be discussing that. And so if people want to read that, I think the whole text is available now on your website, isn't it? And
thebottomline.scot. Our website. Could I also make a plug for our new Twitter that has been launched as well, and it is at Bottomline Scot.
Okay, at Bottomline Scot, yes, good. I did look for it this morning, and when I put in Bottomline, I got something completely different. So you have to say, at Bottomline Scot, okay.
I won't
Okay, so what you're wanting to move the debate as we move towards the referendum, which the Scottish Government has timetabled for October next year. You want to move the debate really towards, first of all, the positive side, and also you're wanting to move the debate away from this broad shoulders of the UK argument. The arguments up to now, and really essentially in 2014, the argument was about what Scotland loses when it doesn't have the protection of the United Kingdom. As you just said a minute ago, some of the stories today indicate that that protection is not what it was.
Yes,
Um,
there is some. Sorry for interrupting you. There is something that is incredible in a way that the unionists, those that favour unionism, have been getting away with for years, and that is the worse the UK economy becomes, the worse becomes their predictions of what would happen to an independent Scotland. And the logic of their argument is, you know, the worse the UK gets, the more we've got to stay, which is an utterly perverse argument. It's not an argument that would win favour with any rational person, but that is in effect what the unionist argument comes down to. Now, what we're saying is, if you look at the actual cost, the price of dependence on the UK, you rightly covered a story a little earlier, Hugh, pointing at, and I think you said that the UK was in decline in a number of ways economically. It's not just that we're in decline relative to other countries, but the decline is the gap between what we could be and what we are held back by in the UK is growing apace. If you look at other countries that do not have anything like the assets of Scotland, but are of a similar size, you find that they're not only doing better than the UK whole, but they're moving further away from the UK because of the UK's broadly its underlying weakness as an economic state. And it is just perverse to argue that Scotland therefore has to remain throttled to a failing state.
so we'll look at the detail of what you're arguing in the paper in just a minute. Before we do that, though, what do the three of you expect to do? You're not the Growth Commissioner. You were on the Growth Commission, weren't you? But this is a private initiative, and I noticed today it has been reported in a couple of the newspapers, so it's getting a bit of resonance already. Both the National and the Herald have covered your launch today. I don't know if you've seen any other media pick you up, but we're delighted to
I'm
devote the programme to
broadcasting
this.
Scotland.
Absolutely. So there's at least the three of us anyway. You're not officially part of the Scottish Government. You're not officially part of the SNP. Is that right? So you're just hoping that people will be better informed about the costs and benefits of independence, or the benefits and the costs of dependence.
I mean, obviously, we're all heavily committed towards independence, but we are acting here as three individuals who want to put our tuppence worth in the debate, who've done this original research that's not been done, and who want to bring that into the public domain. Our hope is that we will broaden the nature of the debate. I think the debate in economics to some extent has been very sterile for a long time. You know, you get people who think they're doing economic analysis because they can look at spreadsheets and make projections from what the UK is just now, and therefore make assumptions of what Scotland would be in the future. This is to completely misunderstand what the nature of economics is about. You can't do it just by reading spreadsheets of numbers. Now, we are going to have papers that involve economic analysis, that involve numbers, statistics, and the like, but we are placing that within a broader narrative, a fuller understanding of what an economy is. You cannot understand an economy just by bold numbers on a spreadsheet. Economies are made up of people. People have to be at the heart of this. People as individuals, as communities, and as a nation. And so all of our narratives will take account of people as well as graphs, as well as numbers and the like. And we think that's essential. If you go back to classical economists like Adam Smith, for example, The Adam Smith economic work grew out of his philosophical works, which he published first, because he was concerned about the nature of mankind, mankind's ambitions, the relationships with one another. And that's what we're interested in as well. I'm not going to say arrogantly we're in the same league as a thinker as Adam Smith, but he had some very profound things to say well over 200 years ago that resonate even today in that regard. People are at the heart of this business, and we have to make sure people are at the heart of any understanding of economics.
Well, let's move on to that. You did say there, and just when we were having a chat before the programme, you talked about a new approach to economics. So let's just look at what you mean by the first big idea you introduced in this paper is the idea of agency. So we'll come to that in a minute. But first of all, just before we do that, the well-being economy, you also talk about that. You say at the start of this paper that the Scottish Government is committed to the idea that the purpose of the economy is really to allow people to lead full and fulfilling lives. So is that what you mean by a well-being economy, first of all?
Yes, broadly, that's fair. I mean, an economy that could be described as having high levels of well-being would be a healthy economy, a healthy society, good mental health, largely people who have a positive outlook, who have control of the future, who want to take control and responsibility and shape the kind of future and believe that they can help shape that. So it involves creating a society and economy where people feel empowered and where people are able to shape the future in a positive light. And that's what we would like to see in Scotland. That's what the Scottish Government would like to see. And therefore, what we have been thinking about is how is that going to be realised? And that's where we start off with the idea of agency, Hugh.
Okay, now, so reading your paper, which I found fascinating, I thought we better start off with what do we mean by agency. So I looked up the Cambridge Dictionary online, and in this context, obviously the word means various different things, but an economic agency, they say, is the ability to take action or the ability to choose which action to take. So that's basically what means I have agency if I'm in charge, right? If I don't have agency, it means somebody else is in charge of me. So that's really what he's talking about, isn't it? But you're going on to argue that if a person has agency, that person feels confident, that person feels that they can look forward and make decisions that the best for themselves. And you also contrast that with a person who lacks agency, somebody who's lacking confidence. And you've made the point in the paper that people who can be identified as having agency are liable to be healthier, happier, live longer, and get better jobs, and also be generally good people, people who can help others, people who feel strong and confident. So that's really what agency at the individual level, people who feel good about themselves.
Yes. And of course, we're going to see it's not just at the individual level, it builds up into the community level, agency at the community level, and of course agency at the national level as well. The way in which, accepting what you say about the dictionary definition of agency is broadly in line with our own. Our own definition follows the idea of positive psychology, and basically there are three components to it. The first is, in the jargon, what's called self-efficacy. And that is, individuals, communities, whatever, saying, I can do something. They believe they can do something, make a difference. There's the idea of optimism. Now, this is not blind optimism, but this is an optimism born of a belief that because they can do things, they have some power to shape their future. So they have a driving optimism to try and make a difference and build a future. And of course, building in those two contexts, there is the third element, and that is bringing to it imagination. People have to be able to imagine the future, aspire to the future. What are your ambitions? What is it you want to achieve? And not just for yourself. What do you want to achieve for your community? What do you want to achieve for your nation? And the belief that you're able to do something purposeful. That's what we mean by agency. And that's what we believe can be unleashed to a much greater extent come independence.
And so the paper argues that agency is good for individuals, but also it spreads. It's infectious, I think is the phrase you use. If your society is full of people
Absolutely.
with agency, you'll have healthy, vibrant communities. And also, you make the point that these communities and people can be resilient because in a world of unexpected shocks, in a world where we've got war in Europe, which we had no idea was going to happen a year ago, you need that resilience because we really don't know what's around the corner, do we?
Yeah, absolutely. You're 100%. You need that resilience, and that resilience too reflects the way in which people engage with one another in society. Agency, even at the individual level, is completely different from what we might call individualism. I think in our paper we actually quote what Adam Smith says, and if I could roughly summarize it, he says, individualism is loneliness, not liberation, whereas belonging brings us home to our humanity. And he talked about the way in which the human nature, when people are safe, secure, confident, in control, they're much more likely to be altruistic. They're much more likely to be concerned about others, not merely themselves. And that concern for others, that concern to build community, that concern to act in mutual interest is what is also part of the idea of agency. And that is something that has the potential to be very powerful for Scotland. In other
Yeah.
words, I think if I could just finish in this little point, and you very often when people talk about what independence brings, they perfectly understandably talk about it means a Scottish government can make all the decisions because it's got all the levers at its disposal. And at one level, they're correct. What we're arguing is that independence brings more than just effective decision making to the politicians you elect. It brings the potential for reinvigorating communities, individuals as well. So it's a broader understanding of what the positive impact of independence can be on the community as a whole.
Oh, okay, so it's not just enough to have individuals who feel empowered, but also communities, and therefore that will raise questions about how to organise local government and how to empower different sectors of the population. So those are issues that will arise after independence. Do you think they need to be discussed just now before independence? How do we actually devolve within Scotland?
Yeah, well, I would say I think it would be a healthy thing to have a debate about institutions, future institutions. Uh, we are not going to be saying what those institutions should look like in any of our papers, but we certainly hope that some of the issues we raise will be part of the debate that could take place. You know, very often our institutions have followed fairly traditional lines of organisation, born of initially views from the UK state and government, the way in which we have set up, although Scotland's always had its own local authorities, the way in which they are given powers, the way in which they exercise those powers, their relationship to central government and the like. It's fairly common in the UK to see institutions and relationships following a fairly traditional type of model. But as the world and the societies become more dynamic, as change happens quicker, I think what we need to do is revisit what should the institutions of the future look like? How do we ensure that people with talent, with interests, with ambition, with imagination, how do we make sure that our institutions make the best of what we are and don't simply act as some kind of bureaucratic funneling process?
Okay, so in a couple of minutes, I'm going to move on to the other side, if you like, which is the negative side of not having independence as an individual or as a nation. But just before we do that, on this kind of scale of agency and confidence on one side, and impotence and lack of agency on the other side, where would you say Scotland is right now? To what extent is Scotland in charge, and are Scottish people in charge of their own fate at the moment?
I think if you were to take it in terms of the economy, I think most of that we are in a state of dependence in the UK. The big fiscal monetary powers and levers all reside at Westminster. The very, very limited powers of what have been given to the devolved Scottish Parliament are far from sufficient for us to be able to make independent decisions about economic policies fit for the Scottish people. So from that point of view, we would be much more towards the end of the spectrum that says we are very much lacking agency in many ways. And that feeds itself through to, for example, you've already mentioned, to local authorities and the like, because of the institutional relationships that are involved. So that local authorities in Scotland have a relationship with the Scottish government. The government doesn't have the economic fiscal levers to actually make it and to serve our joint interests to the way in which they would if they were independent. So in that regards, there's a lot to be gathered. Now, in some other areas, we have more agency. In some aspects of policy making, we have more agency. But we would have so much more if we were independent and we knew that we were independent and could bring together all of the powers that that would give us to make sure we reflect the needs of Scotland, which is basically we reflect the interests of the Scottish people.
Okay, so the downside, the opposite side of agency, it really, as you've said, you've defined it as dependence. Now, reading that on your paper earlier on today, I was thinking of the two Conservative leadership candidates, one of whom is going to be Scotland's Prime Minister without us being consulted. So that's an example of lack of agency. But I'm referring to the idea that we need the broad shoulders of the UK economy. For example, Rishi Sunak said very recently on the Scotland debate, I think because of the Liz Truss dismissing Scotland so rudely the other night, Rishi Sunak said, well, Scotland needed me because I got them through furloughs. So, and also Liz Truss also said, when I'm Prime Minister, I'm going to make sure UK law applies to Scotland. So they're both really, and I suppose Sunak in a nice way, Truss in a nasty way, they're both saying, we're in charge of you, Scotland. This is how it's going to be. So, is that an example of stressing the lack of agency, stressing that we have to depend on the UK?
I mean, it's a nonsense to talk about the broad shoulders of the UK when in your earlier news items, Hugh, you were talking about the failure of the UK economy, and particularly its relative failure compared with many, many other countries in the world, where things are getting worse here than elsewhere. So, broad shoulders of what? Of a failing economic state. I mean, those are not the kind of shoulders I would want to rely on. But yes, I mean, what they have an interest in is making us feel that we can't do these things, that we should not have agency, that we should recognise that however bad things are in the UK, we've got to be dependent on them because they're cleverer than us, because they're able to make decisions in our interest for us, and that we are wrong to believe that we could make better decisions for ourselves. Well, to me, it is, of course, a completely ridiculous argument, but that's essentially the argument that they're going to continue with, because they have no other narrative. They have no other way of stopping Scotland from becoming independent other than creating this pessimism in the Scottish people, making the Scottish people feel that they are helpless in the face of world events, that we've got to be dependent upon England. And it is a desperately sad, depressing, as well as wrong argument. But that's fundamentally the argument, the only argument they've got for stopping us joining the international community of free and independent nations.
And incidentally, you do mention in the paper that in joining the UK internal market, that means Scotland has given up, well, we didn't give up voluntarily, but Scotland has lost EU funding, and that's going to be replaced with UK funding, which, first of all, is probably not going to be as much, but also it's going to be centralised, isn't it? Whereas EU funding was actually given direct to Scotland to spend on Scotland's priorities, the replacement, whatever that will be, they're going to decide, aren't they, in London?
Absolutely. And I mean, it is mean, I'll give you one preposterous example. One of the funds that they're bringing in to replace EU funds from the UK is going to be run by effectively the Department of Housing in England, who's going to decide what Scotland's priorities are. And this has had the preposterous result that they set out criteria which ended up placing Orkney and Shetland and one of our other islands in the same basket as London as least in need. And, the notion that people so distant from Scotland with little interest and know exactly what our needs are is again utterly foolish. And they are far more centralised than the EU were. The EU gave funds and the Scottish government had power, the Scottish Parliament had power to influence the distribution and the priorities. That has been stripped away in the recent actions and recent acts of the UK Parliament. So they're trying to reduce what little agency we had.
Something that occurred to me when I was reading your paper, and you do talk about the UK being unusually centralised in London, it occurs to me maybe England could do with some agency too. Do you think that this argument could have any resonance south of the border also?
Well, I think it would be an argument that could take place in many countries, including in England. I mean, we're setting it in the context of why independence would be a spur and would provide much greater incentive to us having greater agency in Scotland. But of course, this is a debate that can take place in many other countries. And I do think the centralised nature of it, when you look at the recent policy of Liz Truss, which I think lasted for all of 2 hours, when she was saying that we should have a regional payment for civil servants so that those in London would get paid much more and those that lived in poorer regions would get less and so forth. I mean, that was really a kind of logical response to believing in a model of dependency. And all you're doing is you're making that worse because you're making the little fulcrum of power richer and richer and richer at the expense of every other part, in this case of the UK. But I mean, that's what we face, I think, whether we have Liz Truss or Sunak as the Prime Minister, they show little understanding of what the needs are of people out with the southeast of England.
Yeah, we have commented before that the whole move away from Europe and the creation of the so-called internal markets of the UK does tend to mean more and more power and decisions will have to be concentrated on London. That's really the logic of Brexit. But you also mentioned in the paper that UK, anyway, even before Brexit, was unusually top-heavy in that companies usually have to have their head offices in London. That seems to be quite unusual if you compare UK to France, for example. There are many very large regional cities, and if you lived in Lyon, for example, you wouldn't regard yourself as a poor relation, or people in Paris, I think, don't look down on you. But that does happen in England, doesn't it? If you've got to be in London, nowhere else really matters.
Oh yeah. A few years ago, there was a Scottish company, a sort of middling-sized, successful Scottish company, wanted to list itself in the London Stock Exchange for the first time. Now, this had been a successful family-run business built up over the years. They had very good local accounting, local lawyers to advise them, enabled them to grow to the point where they thought they could actually float in the stock market. And when they started going through the process, what they had to do was sack their local lawyers, sack their local accountants, and only hire those that were officially recognised down in the London area. And, what happens is the way in which the whole financial world operates, it forces a centralisation into London. And when that happens, of course, it forces all sorts of other happenings as well around there. And it is fundamentally unhealthy for the whole of the UK. I am particularly concerned that it's very unhealthy for Scotland. And obviously, from our point of view, we wouldn't want to see an independent Scotland replicating the same mistakes as the UK. So we wouldn't want to centralise everything in Edinburgh, for example. We would want to make sure that things are dispersed throughout the country, to make sure that what we do is serve communities and that communities feel this sense of empowerment, that they can make a difference, that they can engage with the centres of power. So we don't want to replicate the centralised model of the UK.
So you've dealt with the argument which unionists always advance that Scotland can't do it alone without England, without the UK. What about the argument then from, if you like, the Gordon Brown argument that, oh, wait a minute, we can reform the UK. We know it's been like that for 300 years, but we can change. What would you say are the limits of devolution? Can you get any kind of meaningful agency in the kind that you've discussed while Scotland is still part of the UK state?
I just cannot see. The UK state has shown itself through the recent years, in the early years of devolution themselves, to not even liking the small amount of devolution that they've allowed and trying to claw it back. And that's why your very good argument, Hugh, when you pointed out the move towards UK funds to replace EU funds has seen a move to further centralise things in London, in Whitehall, away from Scotland. And so, Gordon Brown's been making the same argument since the 1970s. I mean, he's like unfortunately, the record is not completely broken, so he keeps wheeling it out every now and again. But he has never come up with any coherent plan that he sought to implement when he was in power, either as Chancellor or as Prime Minister. If he had so many good ideas about how to empower Scotland, why didn't he do it when he had that power at his disposal? Basically because not in the level of interest that he has in terms of the UK. I mean, I just don't believe a word that he says about his fundamental interest in empowering the people of Scotland.
Well, that, I suppose, is the Labour unionist argument, which will only be available, of course, if Keir Starmer wins the next election. But from the candidates for the Conservative leadership, and again, it looks like Liz Truss is a favourite, there isn't even any talk about further devolution. I think that's, from what I've heard from them, it's going to be the opposite. Is that how it looks like to you?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think we were already under the pressure to move powers back from Scotland to England under the Boris Johnson regime, and there is no indication it will be any different if it's Liz Truss or Rishi Sunak. They will move towards attempting to centralise things even further. And I mean, I think that's just by the utter disrespect that has been shown towards Nicola Sturgeon in recent days.
Yes, there certainly was.
Basically, they don't respect the Scottish people. So, don't be surprised if they want to take more and more of the devolved powers back down to London.
Yeah, I did refer to Liz Truss's remarks the other day about let's ignore Nicola Sturgeon as rude, simply rudeness, but it also reminds me of Boris Johnson's remarks last autumn as we were looking towards the United Nations Environment Conference here in Glasgow, and he said to cheering Tories, he said, I don't want Nicola Sturgeon anywhere near COP26, which is a bit odd. She's a MSP from this city, and of course, she was there a lot more than he was, as it turned out. Now, let me move back to the question of, so we've established the agency. A person with the agency is a person who feels confident, who feels that they're basically in charge of their own fate. And a country with agency also has the actual ability to look at the various options and to choose. I believe somewhere else, I don't know if you can remember where it came from, but there was an argument I read a while ago saying that generally speaking, countries with their own decisions generally make right decisions. They sometimes get it wrong, but a country in charge of its own decisions is going to get it right more than when somebody else is in charge of them. I don't know if you know where that research came from.
I think we, in one of the papers, make some reference to some research. I can't remember off the top of my head. I can't give you the reference off the top of my head. But certainly there is quite a compelling amount of evidence to suggest that if you take the likes of the Norways, Denmarks, New Zealands of this world, they don't make the same decisions as one another. What they do is they make decisions understanding their own communities, understanding their own nations. So New Zealand is able to make decisions in New Zealand's interests, Denmark in Denmark's interests, Norway in Norway's interests. And that has led them all to considerably outperform the UK. And the interesting thing is they're outperforming the UK not merely in traditional economic measures such as GDP, but they're outperforming significantly in terms of well-being. They're outperforming the UK in terms of lack of corruption in society. They're outperforming the UK in terms of happiness of the people and the like. So in all sorts of different dimensions, they outperform the UK, not because they make the same decisions as one another, but because they're able to make the decisions in the interests of their own communities. That's why they've got agency, and that's why we lack the level of agency that we need.
Yep, that's what agency is for. Yeah, one of the issues, one of the research evidence papers that you do refer to in today's paper is from Alessina and Spolari. Now, they wrote a paper with a very amusing title of The Size of Nations. I think they're probably deliberately nodding back to Adam Smith there. And so this paper is saying it's about time economists started looking at whether it's better to be big or to be small. Now, on the one hand, all economists know that big is better because of economies of scale, right? If you can make 1 million of something, it's cheaper than if you can only make 100 of them, right? So economies of scale always apply, but they seem to be arguing the bigger the nation is, the less likely it is that you can deal with individual interests. You know, people who don't fit in the mainstream kind of get ignored. And so the smaller a country is, the easier it is for small interest groups, if you like, to get the ear of government. I think that's what they seem to be arguing. But it's not definite, is it? You can't really prove it, though. But a lot of the smaller nations, well, the more successful nations that you've mentioned, a lot of them are small nations, and they're doing fine, aren't they?
Oh, absolutely. You know, I can't remember how many decades ago it was now that the book Small is Beautiful came out, which is one of the early books looking, including at environmental economics and the like. I mean, basically what their argument is it's kind of like this. You know, on the one hand, we know that the larger units are, the more you can get economies of scale. However, they said, if that was the only thing that mattered, and that was the logic of history, we would end up with only one government for the whole world. So that why then has it been, they ask the question, that since the end of the Second World War, there are now, 3 times as many independent countries that are members of the United Nations than there were when the United Nations were formed. In other words, there's been a growth in the number of independent nations, including all countries of smaller or medium size, such as Scotland. And then they say, and it's very noticeable that these countries are doing very well. They perhaps don't have exactly the same economies of scale, but that is more than made up for because they can tailor policies more readily to the needs of the people. You know, if I put it simply, if you're trying to run China with what's their population, about 1.4 billion or something at the moment, it's obviously very difficult to take account of the very huge variations in interests in a country that size. Whereas a country the size of Scotland with 5 million people is big enough to matter, but small enough to make it relatively comfortable in scale to be able to tailor policies and to be able to pull people together. So from that point of view, the evidence post-Second World War would seem to suggest that small, medium-sized countries overall can outperform larger countries.
Maybe he didn't exactly mean this, but I remember in Walter Scott, in one of his books, I forget which one, it might be Hartman Lothian, he was talking about the old Parliament being wound up in Scotland in 1707, And a woman outside was shouting, when we had rain, people here, we could throw stains at them if we didn't like what they were doing, but nobody's stains can go as far as London. I paraphrase, something like that.
It actually makes the point better than I just made it. I mean, that's basically the fundamental issue. We want the ordinary person. We want people like you and me and the people who are listening this evening to be in touch with the people who make decisions on our behalf, to influence those decisions and to make sure that they listen to us. That's going to happen much more readily once Scotland's independent than it ever will within the UK.
Yep. I don't know if it's anybody else's experience, but when I was growing up, I don't think I ever met a member of parliament until about the age of 25. But since devolution, I've met quite a lot of people in the Scottish Parliament. That's even before I started doing broadcasting in Scotland. So I wonder if other people have that experience as well. But you MPs were a distant group who ordinary people would very seldom see. So we've got more of them now. Now, just before we move on to the next topic, you have been discussing, of course, the welfare and the small nations. Well, let me just talk about some boring economic numbers. I thought we'd look up how well are small nations doing. I've looked at the World Bank figures for the GDP per capita. Now, that's maybe a very misleading figure, but this means the total size of an economy divided by the number of people in it. Now, I'm quoting the World Bank figures, usually from the year about 220 or the couple of years before then. But just the top 5 countries in GDP per capita are Monaco, Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, Singapore, then Ireland. Now, if you just take that last one, because I've heard a lot of unionists say, you can't go independent, you'll be as poor as Ireland. I wish. Ireland per head has 93,000 in US dollars. That's per head. Now, that's just a very crude figure. It's just a GDP per capita. It doesn't mean they all get that. But just by comparison, Ireland at number 5 in this table, 93,000 per head. The UK, I had to look away down the bottom of the table, UK is 28th with 44,000. And then that's a very crude figure, I know, but if you look at that figure, Ireland is more than twice as well off as Britain. Not a lot of people know that.
Yeah, I mean, Ireland has performed remarkably well. I would say particularly over the last 50 years, when David Simpson knows far more about this than myself. David has looked at this in some depth. But when Ireland began to make the kind of decisions that were necessary to look after Ireland, itself, when they began to understand their own needs rather better, and they had people in government willing to do so, they then began to go into a period, and this is now a period that has been one of remarkable growth. So that when people used to use the example of Ireland, it was, oh, look at how pathetically poor you would be if you were like Ireland. Now they tend not to mention, look at Ireland, GDP per head is twice that of the UK. Right? How on earth have they accomplished that when they don't have as rich an asset base as Scotland? Well, maybe it's got something to do with the fact that they're independent, that they had to take decisions in their own interests, they had to accept responsibility as a country, as a community, because there are responsibilities go along with this. But my goodness me, the fact that they are outperforming the UK so well, that tells a story that perhaps needs to be understood more widely.
Yep, and perhaps it's also because they're in the European Union and the single market. So that's roughly coincides with that kind of period you're talking about. I forget when Ireland joined, but it must have been about the period of their big growth. Obviously, must have because of the European Union, I guess. Now, let me just return to that table for a minute on the countries which are doing better than Britain. So I mentioned at the start of the table of 3 small countries in Europe. Also up, let me see, at number 9 is Norway. And then we've got Denmark at number 13, Netherlands number 15, Austria number 16, Iceland number 17, and Germany and Sweden, and Belgium, these countries are all better off than Britain. So that kind of underlines the point you were making. Although I understand that's nothing to do with the welfare economy. That's not a measure of quality of living. That's just a measure of the gross amount of money available per
No,
head.
but quite a number of the countries that you have mentioned also have higher standards of well-being. They're happier. You know, for the last, now I might get this wrong, I think it's for the last 5 or 6 years in a row, Finland has come out as the happiest country in the world.
Yep, that's I've met some
And
Finns.
some other
That's
Scandinavian
surprising.
countries have been much higher. Yeah, well,
Well,
it's a surprise to some of the Finns that I've met, but nonetheless, nonetheless, that's where they have been appearing. And as I said, and if you look at the work of Transparency International, looking at public sector corruption, you will find that some of the least corrupt countries since Transparency International started measuring this, 21 years ago, year on year, the same countries appear as the least corrupt. They are the Norways, they are the Denmarks, they are the New Zealands
that's right. Yeah,
of this world.
yeah, that's right. I
I mean,
looked it up myself.
one of the papers that we will be publishing in a month or so's time deals with the issue of decay, which is often completely ignored by economists.
Mhm. Right. So as we said earlier on, you're moving economics really into a new dimension. That's about welfare, as was said before, but it's also about really. I think your paper, you could say it's a kind of a combination of psychology with economics, and it's
Yeah,
saying that what the economy is all about is well-being, but well-being by the individual can also lead to well-being for the whole community. But as you've said, not in a narrow-minded way, not in the kind of Gordon Gekko way. Do you remember that film? I think it was Wall Street, where the leading character said, greed is good. It's greed that drives the economy. But you're saying that's exactly the opposite to agency.
it's
Agency is
exactly.
being good, but also being a citizen, looking after other people
It's
too.
also, yeah, I mean, agency, an element of agency is altruistic. It's wanting to do good, not just for yourself, but for your community, for your neighbors, for others as well. You know, in other words, we belong to one another. You know, if I just repeat the words of Adam Smith, belonging brings us home to our humanity. Never a truer word, I believe.
Yep, we are social animals. Now, we'll wind up shortly. This has been a fascinating discussion, as I often say, Roger, to our excellent guests. Really, I wish we had another hour, but it is coming up for tea time, so we'll draw it to a close shortly. Finally, my last question to you is the transition. You've identified that agency is important for individuals and for nations. Being in charge is good for you. And you've also identified that Scotland is not very in charge at the moment, and there are lots of negative indicators which show that.
Yeah.
So my question finally is, how quickly can an independent country move towards agency? Would it be a generation change, or could things actually leap forward quite rapidly?
I think things can happen quite fast. I mean, I did some work a good number of years ago in the early years of independence in Namibia, and I was astonished for the few years that I was going back and forward to Namibia to work with different ministries, the rate of progress that was taking place and the way in which the whole nature and the feel about the nation was being transformed. My own guess is what would happen is this would begin to be happening in a purposeful way after we win a referendum or after we win such other vote that may take place to deliver for us independence. In other words, I think it will start happening in the lead up to independence, not having to wait until we get independence and see things happening then. So it can start early, and it can start for those who are arguing the case for independence now. It can start by us arguing a positive case, arguing for optimism about our future, so we can begin to start influencing our culture by the way in which we undertake our arguments.
So yes, there's going to be an explosion of ideas. Really, there was a lot of creativity around the referendum in 2014, and
Yep.
we've certainly found there's a bit more interest in what we're doing here since the First Minister made her announcement that there's going to be referendum next October. I think that we can see anyway from the kind of feedback we are getting from viewers and the kind of subscribers we're getting to that seems to have made people sit up and take notice and think, yeah, maybe things can change. So let me just conclude by reminding you that Roger has been talking about the new group he's set up, the new initiative, along with those two other economists, and it's called The Bottom Line. And if you want to find out more about their work, you look at the website, thebottomline.scot, and Twitter again, it's Twitter at bottomlinescot, all one phrase, isn't it? No gaps. Okay, so that's the first of the papers which we've been discussing today, which is about agency and the positive ideas, the positive benefits of being in charge, both of yourself and of your country. So independence is good for you. Right, so finally, Roger, thank you very much for joining us, and I'll be looking forward to those other papers that you're going to produce over the months, and I wonder if we can have you on again to discuss the next papers that you publish.
More than happy.
Right, thanks. Well, it's been great. I found that a fascinating discussion tonight, and I hope you did at home. So thanks for joining us. I know a lot of people have been watching. I've had some comments online. First of all, I hope that the sound was okay. Somebody said there was a bit of a problem with the YouTube sound. I'm sorry about that. And we've also got a lot of feedback coming in today, and people have suggested other programmes that we might make to follow this up. However, the point I'd like to make, of course, is that we will make whatever programmes our resources allow us to make. So let's move on to our fundraiser. We're launching a new fundraiser for this month, so thank you to everyone who helped us out in the spring. Now, our only source of income comes from our viewers who have looked at our website, which you can see shortly on the screen below, and become our supporters. So if you'd like to become a supporter of Broadcasting Scotland, it would be great if you click on the website there and sign on the direct debit form. Starting at £5 a month, you can become one of the supporters who keeps Broadcasting Scotland going. And we really do need to get quite a lot of money in every month, because obviously your fuel bills are going up, so are mine, and so are the fuel bills for this studio. We have an excellent facility here in Glasgow, tremendous, really state-of-the-art equipment. We can do a lot, and if we just have more volunteers and more money coming in, we will in fact expand the programmes, as some people have been suggesting tonight. Okay, so we do need now, as we move towards this stage where Scotland is going through this discussion, we do need to get more supporters. In fact, we really could do with doubling the number of supporters who are signing that direct debit. I know that times are hard these days, but if you can manage a £5 a month, then that really does make a big difference to what we can put out on Broadcasting Scotland. So please have a look at the website and consider becoming one of our supporters. And so that's it from me tonight. So thank you again for Roger Mullin of The Bottom Line for raising some fascinating questions about where we go forward as a nation. And thank you for watching. And that's it from Scotland at 7 tonight. See you later.